Countless individuals encounter the claim, lose 1 pound of fat every single day, and instantly label it as a magical hack or dangerous quick fix scheme. In truth, the explanation is far more grounded and realistic than it first appears. The human organism already possesses the innate biological machinery to oxidize body fat at a stunning pace, provided a precise hormonal landscape is established. Yet the vast majority of us never unlock that built-in capability because our everyday routines relentlessly drive the body toward energy storage rather than energy release. The core obstacle has never been insufficient discipline or yet another trendy eating plan. The core has always been one straightforward but inconvenient reality. Sustainable fat reduction hinges on correcting the underlying cause, not endlessly treating surface-level symptoms. As long as insulin remains elevated, stored fat remains biologically locked behind closed doors, and no degree of meticulous calorie tracking can override that ironclad rule of human physiology. However, the instant you engineer the internal conditions that permit insulin to plummet and the metabolism to flip into genuine fat utilization mode, the entire experience can feel astonishingly smooth compared to the exhausting struggle most people accept as normal. This approach has nothing to do with self-starvation or falling from marketing gimmicks. It is about grasping how your body actually prefers to source and manage fuel, then choosing to cooperate with that preference instead of fighting against it. The underlying mechanism is uncomplicated, yet uncomplicated is not the same as effortless, because genuine change demands dismantling ingrained routines, confronting cravings head-on, and deliberately stepping away from the non-stop grazing lifestyle that surrounds us and that most individuals don't even recognize as the primary thing keeping them metabolically stuck. The very second you cease perpetuating that feeding cycle and finally permit your physiology to draw upon its own abundant onboard energy reserves, fat loss that once seemed unattainable transforms into a reliable, quantifiable biological outcome, rather than an eternal uphill war you can never win. Fat oxidation dramatically accelerates the moment circulating insulin concentrations fall, and the body regains unrestricted access to its stored triglycerides. This one foundational hormonal principle accounts for more triumphant transformations and simultaneously more crushing disappointments than virtually any other factor in the entire field of body composition management. The majority of people treat fat loss as though it were solely a mathematical game of eating fewer calories or moving more. In reality, the master control panel is hormonal, not caloric. Whenever insulin is elevated, the entire organism is hardwired to hoard energy rather than liberate it. That means even if you successfully reduce intake or grind through brutal workouts, the internal environment is still skewed toward conservation instead of expenditure. Recognizing insulin's dominant role in fat storage does not require a PhD in biochemistry. It simply requires acknowledging one elegant biological law that quietly governs thousands of microscopic decisions inside your cells every day. Insulin's primary job is shuttling glucose out of the bloodstream and into tissues, but it simultaneously commands the body to package surplus energy into adipose tissue and keep it securely locked there. When insulin spikes repeatedly throughout the day, driven by non-stop meals between meal nibbling or foods that provoke massive insulin surges, the body never receives clearance to mobilize its fat deposits. All daily energy demands are assumed to be met by the next incoming meal, the next quick snack, the next surge of sugar. As long as that pattern persists, body fat remains biologically off-limits. Conversely, when insulin finally drops to a low baseline, an entirely different metabolic cascade activates. The body seamlessly transitions from store everything mode into release and burn mode. That is a precise moment stored triglycerides become available, usable, and combustible. It is also why certain individuals witness almost overnight shifts in body weight and energy levels once they adopt practices that reliably lower insulin. They are not mysteriously increasing total calorie burn. They are simply removing the hormonal padlock that has kept tens of thousands of stored calories inaccessible for years. Body fat is not merely excess weight. It is concentrated, high-octane fuel. The typical adult carries 30, 100, 000 calories of potential energy in adipose tissue at any given moment. When insulin falls sufficiently low, the body begins tapping that reservoir without hesitation or delay, because evolutionarily that is exactly what adipose tissue was created for. This is how our species endured millennia of feast and famine cycles long before grocery stores and delivery apps existed. We banked surplus calories when food was plentiful and drew upon them when food was scarce. In the modern world, we almost never experience the drawing upon phase. Yet the biochemical machinery for fat combustion remains intact, fully operational, and eager to function exactly as it always has. The issue is not that the body has forgotten how to burn fat. The issue is that today's constant food environment keeps insulin artificially high so frequently that the fat-burning pathway almost never receives authorization to proceed. When insulin is deliberately kept low for meaningful stretches of time, the body does not require days or weeks to begin oxidizing fat. The switch occurs within hours because the hormonal message is recognized instantly. Most people have been conditioned to believe fat loss is inherently slow and grinding, yet physiologically it can be breathtakingly rapid once the correct metabolic lever is pulled. What makes the process feel sluggish is not biology itself, but endless interference. Non-stop eating, processed foods engineered to spike insulin, chronic stress that disrupts glucose handling, and behavioral patterns that train the body to expect external fuel every few hours instead of ever using its own. At its essence, fat loss is a matter of hormonal authorization. When insulin drops, permission is granted. The moment insulin rises again, even slightly, the gate slams shut. This explains why a seemingly innocent 100-calorie snack can silently derail hours of active fat burning. Even a modest insulin blip instructs the body, stop pulling from storage, burn the new incoming food first. The absolute size of the snack is irrelevant. The hormonal consequence is what matters. This is also why individuals who simply lengthen the time between meals or incorporate structured fasting periods often see dramatic results without overhauling food choices. They are finally providing their physiology with sufficiently long insulin-free intervals to reestablish its native fat-burning cadence. The elegance and simplicity of this mechanism frequently astonishes people because it appears almost too obvious when contrasted with the labyrinthine diet protocols and color-coded food containers they've been sold for decades. But biology does not follow fleeting diet fads. It obeys the ancient hormonal cues it was engineered to heed. Lowering insulin does not demand severe deprivation, expensive supplements, rigid meal templates, or complex point systems. It merely requires granting the body sustained stretches of time without incoming nutrients, so insulin can decline naturally. That might look like eliminating all between-meal snacking, lengthening the overnight fast from dinner to breakfast, or incorporating intentional fasting windows that fit your life. Details differ person to person, but the governing principle never changes. Once insulin remains low for a meaningful duration, the body spontaneously turns to its adipose tissue for energy. That is when individuals begin noticing the surge of stable energy, mental sharpness, and forward momentum that accompany running on internal fuel instead of being chained to external food timing. In a low insulin state, fat becomes the body's favorite energy substrate. It delivers calm, long-lasting power without the roller coaster spikes and crashes typical of high carbohydrate eating. People routinely report feeling lighter and clearer once they cross into sustained fat burning. Not necessarily because a large amount of scale weight have vanished overnight, but because their energy supply is no longer held captive by perpetual glucose-insulin swings. When insulin no longer orchestrates every energy transaction, the body settles into a smoother, more organic rhythm. This is a precise metabolic milieu in which losing a full pound of pure body fat in a single day becomes physiologically achievable, not as a marketing trick or empty promise, but as a logical outcome of finally granting the body uninterrupted access to its own energy stockpiles instead of constantly blocking that access with hormonal barriers. The assertion that fat loss speeds up dramatically when insulin falls is not motivational hype. It is a direct description of humanity's oldest survival circuitry. The modern challenge is not intellectual comprehension of the system, but learning to stop interfering with it. Today's default eating habits relentlessly elevate insulin and thereby sabotage the very outcome people are desperately pursuing. When you begin dismantling that interference, 1 meal, 1 hour, 1 conscious choice at a time, your physiology starts reverting to the metabolic blueprint it was always intended to follow. one in which stored body fat is not a last resort emergency tank, but an immediately accessible, high-performance fuel source the instant insulin steps out of the way. The 1 pound per day concept reflects biological potential, not a universal guarantee, and is entirely contingent on prevailing metabolic conditions. Recognizing this distinction is vital because most hear such a statement and mistakenly interpret it as a promised daily result rather than a demonstration of what becomes possible under optimized hormonal circumstances. The human body possesses extraordinary capacity to mobilize and combust stored triglycerides when the internal environment is correct. Under the right conditions, the speed of fat loss can be startling, yet this capacity does not operate in isolation. It is profoundly shaped by baseline insulin levels, meal frequency, stress hormone profile, sleep architecture, movement habits, and the cumulative metabolic health built, or damaged, over years. The notion of losing 1 pound of fat daily is never intended as a routine expectation. It illustrates what can occur when stored fat becomes the dominant fuel and the body enjoys prolonged, uninterrupted access to the calories it has been hoarding. Rapid fat loss at that magnitude is simply the reflection of a system functioning with minimal hormonal friction, minimal interruptions, and minimal forced reliance on external food. When insulin stays low across many consecutive hours, the body settles into a steady rhythm of drawing from adipose tissue. Given that 1 pound of pure body fat contains approximately 3,500 to 4,000 calories, expending that amount in 24 hours demands profound energy source transition that almost never happens while someone is eating multiple meals and snacks rich in glucose. However, during sufficiently long fasting windows or extended periods without food intake, insulin plunges far enough for continuous fat mobilization to become the primary energy pathway. This explains why individuals following well-designed fasting protocols occasionally register jaw-dropping short-term scale drops. The change is not sorcery. It is merely the predictable result of the body finally utilizing its own reserves with virtually no interference. That said, the speed and ease of this process vary enormously based on how chronically elevated someone's insulin and glucose have been over time. A person with long-standing insulin resistance may need longer or more consistent fasting periods to reach the same metabolic state. Someone with robust metabolic health may slide into efficient fat burning almost immediately. The phrase "simple but not easy" was invented for exactly this scenario. The science is crystal clear. Create sustained low insulin conditions, and fat becomes freely accessible, and the body will increase its oxidation rate accordingly. Yet translating that science into daily life often means dismantling decades of emotional, psychological, and cultural programming around food. People have been trained to eat by the clock, by boredom, by stress, or by social ritual far more than by authentic physiological hunger. Every single instance of food intake triggers an insulin response, even tiny ones, and promptly halts fat burning. Therefore, the duration between eating episodes becomes equally or more important than the episodes themselves. Lengthening those intervals is what unlocks the metabolic circumstances under which rapid fat loss becomes realistic. But lengthening those intervals can feel extraordinarily difficult for anyone accustomed to near-constant intake or heavy reliance on processed carbs that manufacture artificial hunger cycles. This is why the possibility of 1 pound of fat loss per day must always be presented as a reflection of metabolic opportunity rather than a goal to obsess over. The body oxidizes fat at whatever pace its hormonal environment dictates, not the pace we wish for. When the environment is optimized, fat burning accelerates effortlessly without strain and without the sensation of constant struggle. This is precisely why so many describe fasting-driven fat loss as smoother, more stable, and less punishing than conventional calorie-restricted dieting. With insulin held consistently low, the body does not jerk back and forth between fuel sources. It remains in fat oxidation mode for extended stretches, drawing from reserves exactly as it was designed to do during natural periods of food scarcity. Yet the instant insulin rises, even modestly, the process pauses. A single small snack can postpone active fat burning for hours, which is why countless people eat fewer total calories, yet still see minimal progress. They keep interrupting the hormonal sequence required for rapid fat mobilization. Metabolic health extends far beyond just eating frequency. Chronic stress powerfully influences glucose release, and therefore insulin dynamics. Poor sleep disrupts hunger hormones and insulin sensitivity. Sedentary living impairs the body's ability to mobilize stored triglycerides. Even inadequate hydration can hinder smooth fasting transitions. Every one of these variables determines whether the hormonal terrain favors swift fat burning or resists it. Two individuals can follow identical fasting schedules yet experience vastly different rates of fat loss if one is highly stressed and sleeping poorly. That does not mean the strategy is broken. It means the body is faithfully responding to the full spectrum of signals it receives. The capacity for rapid fat loss exists in virtually every human being. How fully that capacity is expressed depends entirely on how well the internal environment aligns with fat-burning physiology. The 1 pound per day idea also tend to generate unrealistic pictures in people's minds. They envision some constant internal furnace roaring 24/7 in perfectly linear fashion. In truth, fat loss is dynamic and fluctuating. Certain days are higher, certain days lower, and daily scale numbers are heavily influenced by water shifts, glycogen status, sodium intake, hormonal fluctuations, and bowel contents. It is completely possible to oxidize a full pound of fat, yet see zero change on the scale, because fluid retention masks it. It is equally possible to drop several pounds on the scale while losing very little actual fat due to early water and glycogen loss during fasting. Therefore, the phrase is best understood as an illustration of peak physiological capability under ideal conditions, not as a day-to-day measuring stick. When framed accurately, the entire concept becomes liberating rather than confusing. It demonstrates that the human body is capable of far more than conventional wisdom acknowledges. It draws a bright line between a metabolism trapped in perpetual storage versus one finally permitted to consume its own energy. It reframes fat loss from an endless slog into a logical governed by clear metabolic rules. Above all, it clarifies that the rate of fat loss is not a moral scorecard, effort, or willpower, but a direct readout of whether the hormonal environment matches the body's original programming. The true objective is never to hunt the arbitrary 1 pound per day number, but to cultivate the internal conditions that make that degree of fat mobilization possible in the first place. Once the body spends a majority of its time in that state, fat loss ceases to feel like warfare and begins to feel like a sophisticated system finally operating exactly as nature engineered it. Frequent between meal snacking single-handedly keeps most people locked in storage mode and prevents authentic fat burning more effectively than almost any other common habit. This one seemingly innocent behavior explains a massive proportion of weight loss plateaus, even among individuals who genuinely believe they are eating clean or stay in a calorie deficit. Modern diet culture actively promotes snacking, claiming it stokes metabolism or prevents overeating later. Yet every single time anything edible crosses your lips, the identical cascade occurs. Blood glucose rises, insulin surges, and the body immediately pivots from burning stored energy to burning freshly ingested fuel. Insulin is indifferent to whether the intake was a 600-calorie meal or a 60-calorie healthy snack. Its biological mandate is to handle incoming nutrients, and when its elevated fat oxidation halts. Consequently, even a small handful of almonds, a low-carb protein bar, a piece of fruit, or a green smoothie can postpone fat burning for hours. The disruption is not about calorie count. It is about the hormonal switch that gets flipped. Someone eating 5, 6, or 7 times daily, even if total calories are modest, rarely allows insulin to drop far enough for meaningful fat mobilization. The cultural normalization of constant grazing is actually quite recent. Throughout most of human history, people consume 1, 2, or at most 3 distinct meals dictated by food availability, culture, or lifestyle. The idea that humans require food every 2 to 3 hours emerged primarily from 20th century food marketing, the explosion of hyperpalatable processed products, and the myth that appetite must be micromanaged with perpetual feeding. Our physiology evolved around alternating periods of feast and fast, not by preference but by necessity. During fasted periods, insulin remained low and body fat served as the primary energy source. During fed periods, insulin rose and excess calories were stored. When modern snacking obliterates the fasted intervals, that natural rhythm becomes impossible to maintain. Fat combustion demands unbroken windows without incoming calories, and snacking eliminates those windows entirely. The result is a metabolism perpetually primed for the next external delivery, rather than ever tapping the enormous internal reservoir sitting in adipose tissue. Many who battle constant hunger or intense cravings assume those sensations prove the body needs food. In reality, frequent snacking is usually the cause of the very hunger cycles people are attempting to escape. Repeated insulin spikes followed by sharp glucose drops create urgent artificial hunger irritability and carbohydrate cravings. This pattern literally trains dependence on nonstop intake. True physiological hunger is far calmer and more patient. Eliminating snacks allows insulin to fall fully between meals, hunger signals to normalize, cravings to fade, and the body to grow comfortable pulling from fat stores during natural daily fasts. Most discover that appetite actually becomes quieter and more predictable once snacking stops, provided they endure the initial adaptation phase long enough for the body to relearn internal fuel utilization. Snacking also promotes mindless consumption, grabbing bites while working, driving, watching screens, or managing emotions, often without registering how much or how often. Each mindless mouthful is another insulin spike, another pause in fat burning, another reset of the metabolic timer. Even impeccably healthy foods trigger the identical response when eaten in this pattern. The body never gets respite. It remains trapped in a loop where storage is reinforced and release is blocked. This is why countless individuals eat pristine diets yet remain stuck. The problem is not food quality but timing and frequency. The organism cannot efficiently burn what it never has to reach for because food keeps arriving. Cultural acceptance of snacking runs so deep that most people dramatically underestimate their true eating frequency. A splash of cream in coffee, a few tastes, while cooking a mint from the reception bowl, a late-night spoonful of peanut butter, all register as nutrient intake and provoke hormonal responses. Someone attempting to fast between meals may unknowingly break that fast multiple times daily. Authentic fat burning only ignites when insulin falls sufficiently low and stays there long enough to trigger the fuel source switch. Snacking creates constant metabolic noise that keeps the system occupied processing new arrivals instead of clearing old storage. When snacking finally stops, a cascade of positive changes begins even before visible fat loss. Energy stabilizes because glucose swings disappear, mental clarity rises as the brain runs on steady ketones and fatty acids instead of erratic sugar. Hunger becomes predictable and manageable, revealing how much previous hunger was insulin-driven demand. These shifts lay the foundation for genuine fat loss because the body finally operates on its intended eat-fast cycle rather than permanent eat mode. With fewer insulin spike, sensitivity improves, cravings, quiet metabolism becomes responsive and flexible. Psychologically, constant snacking fosters a belief that food must always be within arm's reach and that going several hours without eating is dangerous or uncomfortable. This mindset breeds anxiety around hunger and deepens emotional reliance on frequent feeding. Breaking the habit reteaches the natural rhythm of appetite, a gentle rise, a sustained plateau, and, if food is withheld, an eventual gentle decline. Hunger comes in waves that pass rather than intensifying forever. The body learns it can wait comfortably because it has abundant onboard fuel. This insight alone can revolutionize one's entire relationship with eating. The physiology becomes an ally rather than a needy toddler demanding attention every few hours. Removing snacks reaches far beyond simple calorie reduction. It fundamentally reshapes the hormonal landscape. Fat loss flows as a natural byproduct of sustained low insulin periods. Meals become deeply satisfying because real hunger has space to develop. Cravings lose intensity as their hormonal triggers weaken. Above all, the body regains its birthright ability to burn stored fat steadily around the clock. The strategy, eat fewer distinct times, cease grazing, allow insulin to fall fully, sounds almost laughably basic next to the convoluted programs people usually follow. Yet its physiological impact is profound. Once the seemingly harmless snacks scattered throughout the day are eliminated, the body finally receives the uninterrupted space required to exit chronic storage mode and enter the fat release state so many have chased for years without realizing the biggest roadblock was sitting right in their kitchen cupboard or desk drawer. Extended fasting windows restore hormonal harmony and unlock dramatically accelerated fat utilization. The power of this approach becomes unmistakable once you recognize that metabolic state is governed not only by food composition, but often more powerfully, by timing. While most obsess over macros, micronutrients, or total calories, they completely overlook the transformative influence of the hours spent not eating. Those quiet stretches without food are where profound cellular and hormonal reprogramming occurs. Lengthening the daily fasting window grants insulin the necessary time to decline to baseline. And once insulin reaches that low threshold, the entire intracellular environment reorganizes to permit stored triglycerides to be liberated and oxidized. The shift is not minor, it is monumental. It represents the difference between a metabolism wholly reliant on frequent external fuel deliveries and one confidently running on its own vast internal reserves. Many assume fasting equals suffering and deprivation, yet biologically fasting is a powerful signal that activates fuel-switching hormonal rebalancing, enhanced insulin sensitivity, and highly efficient combustion of stored energy. During a sufficiently long fasting window, insulin gradually falls from post-meal peaks. Because insulin functions as a master brake on lipolysis, its sustained decline removes that brake entirely. The drop is not instantaneous. It requires hours, which is why short gaps between eating episodes are metabolically meaningless for fat loss. Extend the gap to 14, 16, 18, or more hours, however, and the metabolic landscape transforms. Liver glycogen depletes blood glucose stabilizes, and fat oxidation becomes dominant. The resulting energy feels remarkably even and sustained because fat is a far cleaner, slower-burning fuel than glucose. After an initial adaptation phase, most report that expected gnawing hunger never materializes or quickly subsides, replaced by calm focus and lightness. Extended fasting windows also favorably alter other key hormones. Growth hormone surges during prolonged fasts, promoting fat breakdown, while simultaneously protecting lean tissue. This distinguishes true fasting from mere calorie restriction spread across many small meals. Frequent eating, even when total calories are low, keeps insulin higher and suppresses fasting-induced growth hormone elevation. The result is sluggish fat loss and greater risk of muscle breakdown. During genuine extended fasting, however, growth hormone helps ensure fat, not muscle, becomes a primary energy source, creating an ideal environment for body recomposition. Another major benefit is restoration of insulin sensitivity. Chronic frequent feeding produces some degree of cellular insulin resistance, requiring ever higher insulin secretion to handle the same glucose load. This creates a vicious cycle of chronically elevated insulin. Extended fasting interrupts that cycle dramatically. With far fewer insulin secretory burst, cells regain sensitivity, needing less hormone to accomplish the same work. Improved sensitivity means smoother fuel switching and reduced tendency to store excess calories as fat. This is why fasting often produces faster fat loss than equivalent calorie deficits achieved through multiple daily meals. Prolonged fasting windows also reliably induce nutritional ketosis. Fat and ketones become the dominant fuel, even in the presence of moderate dietary carbohydrate, when eating resumes. Consistent exposure to this state fosters metabolic flexibility, the ability to seamlessly alternate between glucose and fat according to availability. That flexibility is the hallmark of rapid, sustainable fat utilization. Once adapted, individuals enjoy enhanced mental clarity, rock-steady energy, sharply reduced cravings, and overall sense of lightness that constant eating simply cannot replicate. These benefits arise not from heroic willpower, but from allowing the body to function in the metabolic state it was evolutionarily designed to occupy regularly. Finally, extended fasting windows correct appetite dysregulation caused by perpetual eating. Constant glucose-insulin spikes confuse hunger signals, making them loud, erratic, and urgent. The body grows accustomed to expecting food every few hours, creating conditioned hunger that is not true energy need. When fasting windows are lengthened and snacking eliminated hunger hormones, ghrelin, leptin, etc., recalibrate appetite becomes authentic and manageable, and the body quietly shifts to burning its own fat between meals. The end result is a calmer, more intuitive relationship with food and a metabolism finally free to release stored energy at the rapid, sustainable rates. Prolonged fasting windows shatter that vicious, conditioned hunger loop. The moment the body registers that external calories are no longer arriving on the old, predictable schedule, it rewires its appetite regulation from the ground up. Ghrelin, the primary I'm hungry hormone, stops firing reactive to habit, and begins to rise and fall in a smooth, biologically natural daily arc. The result? Cravings lose their grip, emotional eating fades into the background, and true appetite becomes calm, predictable, and far easier to satisfy. Countless individuals who try longer fasts are stunned to discover that fasting does not turn them into ravenous monsters over time. On the contrary, hunger transforms from a loud, nagging tyrant into a quiet, manageable companion that speaks only when genuinely needed. Another profoundly powerful, yet rarely discussed, advantage of extended fasting periods is the activation of deep cellular maintenance and repair mechanisms that powerfully support sustainable fat loss from the inside out. When the digestive system is finally given extended breaks instead of being kept perpetually busy, the body redirects enormous amount of energy toward internal renovation. Autophagy clears out damaged cellular components, systemic inflammation drops, mitochondrial efficiency improves dramatically, and overall cellular health is restored. Healthier cells possess a far greater capacity to oxidize fuel. Superior mitochondrial performance translates directly into smoother, more effective fat utilization. Lower chronic inflammation sharpens hormone receptor sensitivity and accelerates metabolic responsiveness. These microscopic upgrades may remain invisible on the bathroom scale for weeks, yet they lay an unbreakable foundation for consistent, long-term fat reduction and dramatically improved metabolic resilience. Perhaps the most underappreciated gift of longer fasting windows is the crystal-clear psychological freedom they deliver. Anyone who eats multiple times throughout the day spends an astonishing portion of their mental bandwidth preoccupied with food. What should I eat next? When is the next meal? How many calories is this? Did I already go over my limit? Extended fasting sweeps away that relentless background noise. Fewer eating episodes mean fewer decisions, fewer opportunities for second-guessing, and dramatically fewer cravings to wrestle with. The mind suddenly has spaciousness, quiet, calm, and uncluttered. This mental liberation makes long-term consistency infinitely easier. It dismantles reward-based snacking loops, stars emotional eating triggers, and dissolves the obsessive food thoughts that sabotage most diet attempts. The self-control required to maintain longer fasting windows actually becomes lighter with every passing week. Not because a person magically develops superhuman willpower, but because physiological adaptation and reduced psychological friction make the entire process feel increasingly natural. Stable hunger, surging clean energy, and the absence of blood sugar roller coasters turn what once felt like deprivation into something that simply feels normal in the best possible way. Extended fasting windows are breathtakingly simple in theory, yet revolutionary in practice. They permit insulin to plummet to baseline, render stored body fat freely available, rebalance the entire hormonal orchestra, restore true metabolic flexibility, normalize appetite regulation, and allow the human organism to function exactly as millions of years of evolution intended. In a culture addicted to complex macros, points, phases, and elimination protocols, this elegant simplicity is frequently dismissed as too basic to work. Yet the body has zero requirement for complexity in order to release fat. All it requires is sufficient uninterrupted time without incoming food. Provide those quiet windows, and fat oxidation accelerates to levels that astonish people who have spent decades meticulously counting every calorie, white-knuckling through hunger, and watching the scale refuse to budge. The true art is not depriving the body, but finally stepping out of its way so it can use the tens of thousands of calories it already carries. Calories themselves are far less important than the hormonal context that decides whether those calories are burned for energy or locked away as fat. This single realization obliterates one of the most stubbornly held myths in modern weight loss culture. For generations, we have been indoctrinated to believe that fat loss is nothing more than simple arithmetic. Consume fewer calories than you expend, and the body must come from stored fat. But the human body is not a spreadsheet. It is an exquisitely tuned hormonal ecosystem governed by sophisticated biochemical signals that dictate, moment by moment, whether incoming energy is utilized immediately, stored for later, or preserved against perceived famine. Two individuals can ingest the exact same number of calories daily and achieve radically different body composition outcomes, not because one possesses superior discipline, but because their hormonal environments are sending completely opposite instructions. When insulin dominates the system, calories are aggressively shuttled into storage, particularly adipose tissue. When insulin remains low, those same calories can be burned cleanly for fuel or even dissipated as heat. This is precisely why meticulous calorie counting fails so many dedicated, disciplined people. The hormonal gatekeeper overrides the math. No hormone wields greater authority over this process than insulin. Insulin alone decides whether fat cells remain sealed shut or swing wide open, whether energy is stockpiled or liberated, whether the body runs primarily on dietary glucose or seamlessly taps its abundant fat reserves. A person walking around with chronically elevated insulin can slash calories, eliminate sugar, swear off processed foods, and still watch body fat barely move because a hormonal lock on their adipose tissue remains firmly in place. Even with reduced intake, the body responds by downregulating thyroid output, lowering core temperature, increasing subjective hunger, and dialing back spontaneous movement, all to preserve precious energy reserves. This produces the all-too-familiar yo-yo pattern: early water weight drop, long miserable plateau, crushing fatigue, and eventual rebound overeating. This is not personal failure. It is the body's protective hormonal response interpreting calorie restriction as existential threat rather than invitation to burn stored fuel. Meanwhile, another individual consuming the same or even greater calories, yet maintaining low insulin between meals through longer fasting windows, enjoys effortless access to stored body fat and a humming, responsive metabolism. The contrast becomes starkest when examining insulin-resistant individuals. Insulin resistance forces cells to ignore normal insulin signals, prompting the pancreas to secrete even higher amounts to achieve the same glucose-clearing effect. The result? Fat cells remain barricaded for extended periods, even when total calorie intake is modest. Chronically high insulin literally denies the body permission to use its own stored energy. This explains why some people mysteriously gain weight despite eating like a bird. The problem is never the raw number of calories. It is a persistent absence of hormonal authorization to mobilize fat. When stored fat remains biologically inaccessible, the body screams for quick glucose through intensified hunger, lethargy, and irresistible cravings, creating the false narrative of weak willpower. In reality, the individual is trapped inside a hormonal cage. Until insulin finally drops and stays low, meaningful fat oxidation remains physiologically almost impossible, regardless of how heroically calories are restricted. The mirror image is equally true. When insulin is kept low for sustained periods, even a relatively generous calorie intake can coexist with steady fat loss because the body continues burning its own reserves between meals. Low insulin restores true metabolic flexibility, the ability to fluidly alternate between food-derived energy and stored body fat as circumstances require. This flexibility maintains high energy expenditure, stabilizes appetite, and virtually eliminates carbohydrate cravings. This is why practitioners of time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting routinely describe fat loss as easier, more linear, and dramatically less stressful, even when they are not consciously undereating. They have engineered a hormonal environment that actively favors fat release rather than storage. Hormones, not calories, ultimately decide the fate of every bite. Will it fuel muscle repair and daily activity or be packaged into adipocytes? Insulin casts the deciding vote every single time food is consumed. Another critical reason calories pale in importance next to hormonal environment is that the body dynamically adjusts its total energy expenditure according to hormonal cues, not the number on the nutrition label. Restrict calories while insulin remains high and the body interprets scarcity and slams on the metabolic brakes. Lower body temperature, crushing fatigue, irritability, reduced spontaneous movement, all classic survival adaptations. Fat burning grinds to a halt because the hormonal message screams, store everything. Conversely, restrict eating frequency, allow insulin to fall, and give the body uninterrupted access to its massive fat reserves, and metabolism often remains robust or even elevates. The body feels safe and abundant because it literally carries weeks or months of onboard fuel. No perceived famine, no need to downshift energy expenditure. This hormonal stability is why traditional calorie restriction dieters suffer cold hands and constant hunger, while fasting-adapted individuals feel warm, energized, and satisfied on fewer calories. Hunger itself is governed almost entirely by hormones, not by how many calories were consumed hours ago. Two identically sized meals can produce wildly different satiety profiles depending on their insulinemic impact. A high carbohydrate, insulin spiking meal can leave someone ravenous 2 hours later despite containing enough calories for 6 hours of activity. A protein and fat-rich meal, or simply extending the fast, can produce effortless satiety for twice as long on fewer calories. Ghrelin, leptin, peptide YY, and insulin itself choreograph the entire sensation of hunger far more powerfully than raw energy intake ever could. Calorie counters stay hungry because their hormonal symphony never shifts into fat-burning key. Fasting practitioners often eat less overall, yet feel genuinely satisfied because their hormones are finally aligned with abundance rather than scarcity. Food quality and timing matter precisely because they're the primary levers that control hormonal responses, and hormones, not calories, dictate storage versus oxidation. Frequent eating, even healthy snacks, maintains elevated insulin and blocks lipolysis. Compressing eating into fewer hours allows insulin to collapse and fat burning to dominate. Processed carbohydrates provoke massive insulin and often cortisol, surges that drive storage, while whole food proteins and fats produce gentler responses that permit easy fat access. These are hormonal phenomena, not caloric ones. Someone can enjoy a large, satisfying, higher-calorie meal, yet continue losing fat rapidly if insulin remains low afterward and a long fasting window follows. Another person can meticulously undereat yet gain fat because constant grazing never allows insulin to fall far enough to unlock storage. Obsessing over calories alone is like trying to steer a ship by staring at the wake instead of the rudder. Hormones are the rudder. Without grasping this, calorie reduction remains a frustratingly blindfolded endeavor. Hormonal optimization determines whether fat is liberated, oxidized, or hoarded, whether hunger rages or remains quiet, whether metabolism revs or stalls, whether cravings torment or disappear. When the hormonal environment is deliberately optimized, primarily through reduced meal frequency and generous fasting windows, the body spontaneously oxidizes fat at an accelerated, stable pace. Fat loss ceases to be a brutal test of willpower and becomes an elegant physiological inevitability. This is why calories matter far less in the hormonal context in which they are consumed. Hormones, not calories, write the final instruction manual for every morsel of food. The deeply entrenched belief that cravings simply reflect poor self-control is one of the most damaging myths in the entire fat loss conversation. When someone confesses, "I just don't have enough willpower," they are actually describing an intense biochemical civil war raging between competing hormonal signals that are desperately trying to drive them toward food despite their conscious intentions. Cravings are not moral failings. They are sophisticated physiological communications influenced by insulin status, ghrelin and leptin balance, cortisol levels, sleep debt, and the body's current fuel availability perception. When someone adopts longer fasting windows or fewer daily meals, cravings frequently spike temporarily, not because the strategy is flawed, but because the body is in active transition. Recognizing this removes the shame and replaces it with strategic patience. True hunger and cravings are entirely different animals. Authentic hunger builds gradually, accompanied by physical cues like a quiet stomach or mild energy dip. Craving strikes suddenly, specifically, and emotionally, almost always for hyperpalatable, glucose-spiking foods. When someone has trained their body to expect food every few hours, ghrelin surges on cue, not because energy stores are genuinely low, but because the brain anticipates calories at that time. Early in fasting adaptation, those scheduled ghrelin peaks persist, creating powerful cravings that feel like emergencies. This is biological recalibration, not personal weakness. Insulin is a silent conductor of many cravings. Chronically high insulin locks fat away. So even with tens of thousands of stored calories on board, the body behaves as if it is starving, triggering survival-level food-seeking behavior, especially for fast-acting carbohydrates. Frequent processed carb intake keeps this dysfunctional loop spinning. Break the cycle with fasting and insulin eventually falls. But during the adaptation window, the body may still cry out because it hasn't yet relearned how to efficiently mobilize fat. Stress pours gasoline on the fire. Elevated cortisol interprets psychological or physical stress as immediate danger and drives appetite toward dense, quick energy foods. Combined with high insulin, this hormonal tag team becomes almost irresistible. Poor sleep delivers another crushing blow. A single bad night raises ghrelin, crashes leptin, and amplifies food-seeking behavior the next day. Again, not a character defect, but measurable hormonal disruption. Dopamine seals the deal. Hyperpalatable foods hijack reward circuitry, conditioning the brain to expect a neurochemical payoff at certain times or emotional states. Breaking that conditioning feels excruciating at first because the brain is mourning the expected dopamine surge, not because the body needs the calories. The beautiful truth is that every single craving is a wave with a beginning, peak, and end, usually lasting only minutes. If the wave is allowed to pass without being fed, the neural pathway weakens. Over weeks of consistency, and the cravings lose their power, not because willpower finally won, but because a hormonal and neurochemical demand simply quieted. Once insulin stabilizes at lower levels and the body becomes adept at burning stored fat, cravings collapse. People routinely report feeling dramatically more in control, not because they became mental giants, but because the hormonal screaming finally stopped. Managing cravings is therefore less about white-knuckling and more about engineering an internal environment where the body no longer needs to scream. Stable blood sugar, consistent fasting windows, excellent sleep, lower stress, and a repeated experience of, I have plenty of energy for my own fat. When that trust is earned, cravings fade into background noise. Understanding cravings as biochemical messages rather than personal shortcomings removes the guilt and provides a clear roadmap. Fat loss becomes far less emotional and far more mechanical. Cravings feel like tidal waves of weakness, sudden, overwhelming, almost primal. Yet they are sophisticated hormonal conversations, not character judgments. Insulin, ghrelin, cortisol, leptin, and dopamine are simply talking to one another, and we experience their dialogue as an urgent desire for specific foods. Grasping this makes everything less personal and infinitely more manageable. Consistency is the invisible engine that transforms fat loss from chaotic struggle into predictable physiology. Everyone hunts for the perfect protocol, but the body doesn't care about perfection. It cares about predictability. The human organism thrives on rhythm. It adapts to repeatable patterns far better than to ever-changing rules. This explains why one person using the same fasting window as another can melt fat effortlessly while the other stalls. The difference usually lies in consistency of application. When eating windows, fasting duration, meal frequency, and food quality follow a dependable daily pattern, the entire hormonal orchestra tunes itself to that rhythm. Hunger hormones learn when to rise and when to rest. Insulin drops reliably. Cortisol calms. Metabolic flexibility blossoms. But when the schedule bounces unpredictably, breakfast one day, no breakfast the next, late night eating some days, early cutoff others, the body stays metabolically confused, never fully committing to fat as fuel. Consistency in reducing or eliminating snacks is especially powerful. Erratic attempts, I'll try not to snack today, keep insulin bouncing and prevent the deep adaptation that makes fat loss feel effortless. Repeat the same structure day after day, and the body finally relaxes into the new normal. Fat becomes a default between meal fuel. Hunger quiets. Cravings vanish. Psychologically, consistency eliminates decision fatigue. No more daily negotiations. No more, should I break my fast early? The mind is freed from constant food-related debate. Stress drops. Emotional eating evaporates, and adherence skyrockets. The body interprets routine as safety. Stable routines lower cortisol, improve sleep, balance appetite hormones, and make longer fasts feel effortless rather than heroic. Even food quality benefits from consistency. Wild swings between ultra-processed and whole foods keep insulin and dopamine on a roller coaster. A generally stable pattern, even if not 100% perfect, allows metabolism to gain momentum and efficiency. Consistency does not mean rigid perfection. It means choosing a supportive structure and repeating it long enough for physiology to trust the new rules. Small deviations are inevitable and harmless, but the overall pattern must remain recognizable week after week. Do that, and the hormonal system calms, metabolism revs, hunger becomes intuitive, and fat loss shifts from forced to almost automatic. Watch two people follow the same plan. One eats within the same 8-hour window every day, skips snacks 6 to 7 days a week, keeps food quality reasonably stable. The other follows the same 8-hour window some days, skips others, snacks here and there. From the outside, both look equally committed. Inside, their hormonal environments are worlds apart. The consistent person's body fully adapts and fat melts predictably. The inconsistent person's body never quite trusts the pattern and holds fat protectively. Once true consistency takes root, something almost magical occurs. Fat loss stops being emotional. Food thoughts quiet. Craving fears dissolve. Doubt evaporates. The body stops resisting and starts cooperating, mobilizing fat stores on schedule, delivering steady energy, and making the entire process feel effortless. What once demanded heroic effort becomes a new normal, not because a person changed who they are, but because they gave their physiology the one thing it actually needs, a reliable rhythm it can finally believe in.